Hello and welcome to another Opus Well Style podcast. My name is Iván Watanabe. I'll be joined with my partner, Evan Wohl. Evan, what's going on, man? Good to see your face. How are you?
Yeah, you too. glad we're doing this. Like, it's always not just this episode. I mean, like, podcasts in general. It's funny how everybody's got a podcast. So when I say I've got a podcast, it's almost like cliche these days. But it's nice. If nothing else, it's a nice excuse for us to get together and chat.
For sure. I also think it gives us an opportunity to kind of flesh out some of the thoughts or ideas or concepts that we've been reviewing, either between you and I or with clients or just sort of in our industry. So I think it gives us an opportunity and just some dialogue to share some more information. So I think I'm grateful that we have it for sure.
Yeah, it's gonna be a good one today. Yeah. We've been putting a little more work into this one than the average.
Yeah. It's so for the listening audience, right? I've been having this conversation with clients, and so has Evan, and it's all around sort of education funding opportunities for our kids, planning savings opportunities for them, we talked a lot to our contemporaries and our mentors just on sort of our thought process around funding education, but also, are we stuck in theory or, our general concepts are really valid and this is actually how education will get funded in the future. So, it's been kind of an interesting few weeks reviewing these different opportunities. So we wanted to have a conversation today just to talk a little bit about the way we think about education funding, and also how we think of, and what the options may look like and the pros and cons of using different vehicles for that. And Ev, anything you want to kind of add or any things that you've been thinking about or that you think would be worth mentioning at this point?
I'm sure it'll all come up in conversation. Most of this topic comes from clients wanting to chat about how they can save money for their kids in general. The majority of those conversations tend to focus on college. But some people would like to set something up for their kids that is not necessarily earmarked for college, but maybe a little bit more down the road, help out with, their first down payment or, get them off to a good start in life. So, there's a lot of different aspects to which vehicle are you choosing and for what reason, pros and cons. And so we'll try to touch on most of those today.
Definitely. And as we kind of have the conversation, I want to set the stage of the dialogue that I'm having with folks. So when a client will approach and say, hey, listen, we're having a child, or, we just had a child and we're having a conversation. What should we be doing for education savings? I heard a 529 plan is the right way to go. Should we be using a UTMA account? Should we be using life insurance? What other vehicles should we be thinking about? It's very product centric, right? It's very much like what widget is going to allow us to get and pay for college. But if you kind of take a step back, the question that I ask to clients all the time is, do you actually care what account or vehicle you use to pay for college? Or do you just want to make sure that you have the ability to pay for it when that check is due? And they always say, yes, I don't care what it is. I just, or they say, no, I don't care what it is. I just want to make sure that I have the ability to pay for it. And so with that in mind, we plan for education funding the way we do everything else. Less about the widget and way more about the strategy of accomplishing the goal of funding education. And in order to have strategy, you need to have options, and you need to have as much control as you can possibly have around whatever is going on in the universe at that particular time, right? And so, the conversation I have with clients is mainly 529 plan centric, because that seems to be like the one main thing that they've heard about and use for college funding. And if I have a conversation with folks, it seems very much like the 401k. They are very proud that they have a 401k plan. You go to a cocktail party, somebody's like, well, you just had a baby 2 weeks ago. Have you set up the 529 plan yet? There seems to be this inherent badge of honor to have this account set up for education when, and we're going to go into it in a little bit, that may not be the best option to fund education, right? There's so many scenarios that we've discussed where clients actually kind of resent the fact that they have a 529 plan because of the limitations when they actually needed the funds for sending their kid to college, right? And so what I wanted to kind of think through is, or talk through is, viewing funding your child's education is way more about strategy than a product, right? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I would even say, similar to retirement, funding college is more about having flexibility of options than it is about any one product. In the same sense that the 401k is not the goal, retirement is the goal. Like a healthy retirement is the goal, and so there's lots of different options, lots of different ways to get to retirement, just like there's lots of different ways to save for and pay for college. And there's, similar to retirement, there's a lot of risks and unknown of retirement. Same thing is true with college, which we'll get into.
Yeah.
But I think having in both cases, having the maximum amount of options available to you at that point is just going to allow you to make the best decision in that moment. And
right.
You know, it is impossible to know what the landscape will look like in the future when your kids are going to college or when you're going to retirement. Specifically, you know, what we're referring to there is, what are interest rates looking like? What is the market looking like? You know, what is your employment and income stability looking like? There's all these different components that play into what is the best strategy for you and your family.
Yeah. You know, it brings me back to something that you and I heard from Marty Nackimson recently, which was the desire to do the right thing has us thinking that the methodology is the right thing, right? So the desire to fund college has us thinking that a college savings account is the methodology, but it's actually just, you know, it's an account. It's just one widget to help us get there, right? So, you know, if we're gonna go with the premise that it's important for assets that are growing to continue to grow on the compound interest curve untouched, right? If we can have that conversation, if we can set the stage of saying investment accounts are assets growing unimpeded on the compound interest curve will create the most amount of value long term, then we have to make judgments, or we have to assess where to get money for or from for those life events with the lowest opportunity cost at every stage, right? So the asset with the lowest opportunity cost is going to be cash flow, right? If you have the ability to pay for education out of cash flow, that is going to be the cheapest money, the lowest opportunity cost at that particular time for you to fund education, right? So, you know, for many of our clients that are high income earners and always will be high income earners, writing a check from cash flow is going to be the cheapest source of capital for you to be able to do that, and probably the best at that particular time.
Yeah,
right?
and just to simplify for, you know, if you don't know what Iván means by cash flow, you're earning money on a, you know, as you work, as you go on in your career, and every year some amount of that money hopefully is being saved into the 401k, into non-retirement investments, savings, insurance, all these things. And so the years that your children are in college, instead of that amount of money going to your investments, just goes directly to college. And so that's an example of what it means to pay for college out of cash flow. It's just, instead of putting money into your investments, you're going to forego the contributions to your investments those 4 years or however many, you know, years your kids are in college, and instead it goes directly to college.
Yeah.
To tuition.
Perfect. I appreciate that. You know, it's very funny because, you know, I fund a significant amount of money funneling to daycare for my kids. You know, it's basically a college tuition for kids to go to daycare. And I didn't plan for this 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 18 years ago. wasn't like something I had thought about. I'm going to have kids in 18 years, so then I'm going to have to fund daycare. I pay it out of my cash flow, right? It just comes from my earnings and it goes directly there. It's not something that I saved or planned for. So it's really interesting that at the level that we're currently funding daycare or nannies or sports, it may not be a tremendous difference between funding an education, tuition and what you're currently paying for your childcare, right? So again, think about it like that. If the cheapest opportunity cost there would be to use your cash flow, right, to fund it.
And let's just spend a minute on what we mean by compound interest, compounding over time, and opportunity cost. So, the ideal scenario is that your assets grow unimpeded over time, and over time meaning as long as possible. So that's the miracle of compound interest, is that the longer you leave it in there, you get interest on your interest. And so typically, you'll see the first 10 years, you're not seeing as much growth in your assets. And then in the second 10 years, 10 to 20 years, now you're starting to see it really pick up. And then thereafter, 10, 20, 30 years and beyond, 20 to 30 years and beyond, that's where you're really starting to see explosive growth within your assets. The problem with planning for college, as most people do, I think, is they plan for 18 years and then they just deplete it all, send it to college. And so that account or those assets never got the benefit of long-term compounding. Okay, so that's the compound curve or compound interest. And then opportunity cost is just to say, all right, if our investments are invested, they're invested in the market and it's growing at X% rate per year, over the long run, let's say, if it's growing at 8, then selling your investments to go fund anything, but in this case, let's call it college, cost you 8% because it's the amount of money that you would have earned had you let it stayed in there and continued to grow invested. And so the opportunity cost of selling your investments in this scenario is 8%, versus paying for college right out of cash flow or income. I don't think there's much, if any, opportunity cost on that. And so that's what we're referring to as looking for the lowest opportunity cost, while also hopefully compounding assets for as long as possible the rest of your life, ideally.
Got it. It's funny, again, strategy wise, if I'm having a conversation with a client, trying to figure out what options may make sense, a few years ago when mortgage rates were in like the sub 3%, taking a cash out refi on your home and using those funds to send your kid to college was one of the cheapest costs of money ever. Mm-hmm. That is a tremendous opportunity to be able to refinance the house, use money at less than 3%, which again, if you were going to pull from some other asset, allows you to keep those assets invested long term, right? Mm-hmm. So you're borrowing money at 2.75%. Those interest payments are relatively low interest. All you had to do with the rest of the money that you had saved and invested is to continue to let that money compound and grow at a rate that's higher than 2.75 for that strategy to have made sense. And so when we think about those kinds of things, saving in these one widget type vehicles that have one purpose, you don't give yourself the opportunity to be creative and to actually leverage those other type of strategies to fund education in that time frame, right? So had clients taking home equity lines of credit or home or cash out refis to use for education because the cost of money was so cheap, mm-hmm. right? We talked to a colleague of ours whose father, he went to a state university. So his father purchased in order to get in-state tuition, his father purchased an off-campus house in that state, and both his kids went to that, lived in that home and then got in-state tuition, right? And then used the rents from the rest of the roommates to fund that home price. That is a strategy. That is not a widget that allowed him to fund education. Not only did he drop the price of that education down tremendously by having that in-state tuition, but then he was able to pay for it by using an asset that continued to grow, right? So the cost of that was less than nothing. He actually turned a profit on that strategy, right? And I think that is what I invite people to think about as they look at tackling any type of event in their life when it requires capital, whether that's retirement, funding education, funding an investment property, investing in private equity, like looking at all the different options that are available on the table and figuring out which one suits people best. Right. And I think when people are looking again to that one particular widget, it may limit you from having options, right? So that might be a good time for us to kind of go through what are the options that are typically discussed most often for saving for kids, right?
Yeah.
I think a 529 plan, as we mentioned before, is usually the one that gets brought up the most.
Yeah, well, especially as it relates to saving for college. And just to be clear, we're not against 529s. We're not really pro or con anything, but the question is, how can you maximize your options available to you for whatever, endpoint or end goal you're trying to accomplish?
Right.
So, when we have conversations around how to save for kids, there are the three most common. One is an account for a minor, a UTMA or UGMA. What those stand for is not so important, but for a UTMA, the way that works is it's an account that, if I have UTMA accounts for my three kids. I'm the owner, they are the beneficiary of their accounts. Any money that goes into those accounts are considered irrevocable gifts that, once it goes in, now that's their money. If I were to take it back out, it needs to be for their benefit. So I could take it back out and say this is going to be for their camp or whatever expense. They've got plenty of expenses. Upon their age of majority, which is different in each state, they become the legal owner of that account. Okay, so that's an important point to be aware of. Inside of the UTMA, you could either have it sit in cash like a savings account, or you could invest it like a brokerage account, kind of in whatever way you see fit for your children. Okay, so that's one. The second, like we talked about, 529, just real quick, the way that works. Every state, again, is different. So you'd have to look up the state laws, but some states have a state tax deduction for a 529 contribution. I don't know the exact number of states. I think there's more states that don't have a state tax deduction than do. I live in the state of New Jersey, and there's no state tax deduction for any contributions to 529s. And so there's no deductibility for me to put money into a 529. That's both on the federal and state level. Please do, by the way, if you're having questions about this, speak with your accountant about your specific tax situation. Once the money is then in a 529, they're typically state-run plans. So New Jersey, state-run plan, New York, et cetera. Inside of those plans, most of them are going to be have options available to you of what's called a target date fund. The way that works is it starts out most aggressive while your kids are younger or youngest, gets more conservative as you get closer to college. Now, invested in the market, right? So that there's no guarantees in a 529. It can go up, could go down, could work out for you, could not work out for you. If, for example, the market is poor, not performing well in the early years when the account is most aggressive, and then maybe positive in the later years when you're closer to college and the account is more conservative, that timing didn't work out for you. But of course, the opposite could be true. It could work out for you great. So there's uncertainty or market volatility involved in the 529. And then most importantly, the money needs to be used for higher education. It can also be used for private school, but predominantly it is used for higher education. If there is money left over after college, up to $35,000 per child can go into a Roth IRA. Okay, but they're still they need income to be able to contribute to their Roth IRA, and they still have to hit or will bump up against the contribution limits in that year. So it's not going to be like a 1 year $35,000 contribution. Which is very tricky about planning for college, which is very similar to planning for retirement, is the unknown. You don't know how much college will cost you entirely if you've got, one kid or two kids or three kids or more. If we project forward, some of the common projections that we do for a baby born today, if you take $40,000 of current annual tuition, which is, I think, pretty reasonable, and project that forward at 5%, so more than inflation, which typically, at least historically, college tuition has been growing more than inflation.
Last few, I mean, I've looked at projections for some of them. It's like almost close to double digits. I mean, in terms of the cost, yeah, for sure.
But even growing at 5% for 18 years, you're looking at $500,000 for a baby born today for 4 years of college. That's assuming they get college done in 4 years, right?
Yep.
That's per kid. Now, is college actually going to cost that much when 18 years from now? I don't know. That's a big pill to swallow. And so maybe at some point there's a bigger shift towards 3-year colleges, towards what's it called when you go to school for a trade school, right?
Yep, trade school.
Where it's more for electricians or plumbing or whatever. Or maybe your kids get scholarships or go to school abroad. So there is so many unknowns, and there's nothing wrong with putting money into a 529, but what you don't want to do is overfund a 529. You don't want to get more money into a 529 than you end up using or needing for college. Yeah. That's
the other benefit. I don't know if you had mentioned it, Ev, is that the purpose of putting it inside of a 529 plan, assuming that you use it for education, is that the growth is going to be tax free.
Yes. Yep. Big one. Thank you.
Right. So the principal that you've invested in any other normal investment account will come out tax free. But the growth inside of a 529 plan, so long as you use it according to the rules of the 529 plan at that time, will also come out tax free. But it's interesting because if you sort of look at the pros and cons of what do you get from it or what do you not, depending on how much growth you actually have inside of a portfolio, was it worth the tax benefit to lose the loss of control? I'm not really sure, right? Or the potential tax and penalty that could be due if you use it for something different.
Mm-hmm. The loss of utility along the way. I think, some clients, maybe if they're a little bit more comfortable taking risk and they have an investment opportunity come their way and available to them, maybe they want to use some of their assets to go invest in that thing, whether it's a private business investment, their friend is raising money to start a business, whatever the case may be. But if it's in something like a 529 or even a 401k, unless you're taking a loan from a 401k, money is not available. And so you lose the utility of that along the way. And, in our scenario, if instead you put it into something else that got you a better rate of return and, you can use all along the way, most people would prefer the flexibility to be able to say, all right, here's the current market environment. It's best to use this money versus that money, or just pay for it out of cash flow. But you do need to set up those fundamental pieces beforehand.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do find that 529 plan is a nice place for grandparents to stick some cash, right?
Yeah.
As a gift. It seems like this sort of is it appropriate to fund your child's 529 plan out of your own cash flow, right? Are you going to invest on a monthly basis into this particular account or write lump sum checks? That's kind of one part of the equation that you need to consider. And the second part is sort of gifts from family members. Is that a nice place to put it in? And for me personally, I think the gift piece of it makes a ton of sense because it's their money that's going into it, and it'll hopefully grow, and then that sort of thing. But using my own personal cash flow for it, I think for us, I don't mind the idea of the 35K up, and have it be a Roth and have it for their particular retirement.
Sure.
At least they'll get some level of utility for it. So I'm personally comfortable with that. But, some folks don't like having money locked up for one particular thing. And then if they need it, that there's going to be some penalties associated with it. It's a little bit tougher to swallow.
And also, if we're saying that paying for college out of cash flow or income is going to be the lowest opportunity cost, not everyone's going to have the stability or confidence that their income will be there when they need it and for college. And so, we were fortunate that when Lori's grandparents passed away, we inherited a little bit of money, and so we put that money into a 529. I have two 529s for my three kids, not because I don't love the third, but because you could change beneficiaries unlimited number of times. And so I feel very confident that of my 3 kids, we're going to be able to use that money no problem.
Yep.
But it does require, observation. As you get closer to retirement, you're seeing these 529 accounts grow, and you're having a better sense of, all right, what are they going to private school? Are they going to state schools? Might they get scholarships? And so, you kind of, those for sure for me will be the first dollars that I use because it needs to be used for that. Beyond that, it's likely coming from either cash flow or overfunding of the cash value of my life insurance.
Yeah. And what's interesting is having a high income or high net worth does not preclude your kids from getting a scholarship. Like I want to make that very, and grants, right? I want to make that very, very clear. I mean, I have a number of clients that are wealthy that have saved into 529 plans for, a decade plus, and their child gets a scholarship, and now they're resenting the fact that they had put the money into those accounts all those years, right? Because they could save it for their grandkid that doesn't exist yet. That might be nice, but most of them feel like I saved the money in for this one particular purpose, and now my kid gets a scholarship, which is great, but I don't know what to do with these dollars anymore. And this wasn't the purpose of really why I stick the money in there. I think we have one colleague who we spoke to recently who the brother had saved money into the 529 plans for both his kids, and both his kids ended up getting scholarships. And so he is retitling the 529 plans into his nephew's names, and the nephew's dad is now paying the brother back, right, for the funds that they put into the 529 plan. So having to do that because that account has one particular utility is not attractive to me personally, again, up to a certain level. But, I think it makes sense for certain utilities, but I'm not a huge fan of the restrictions personally.
Yeah, I think that's the case for most people. I don't know if most people are even aware of it, but especially if you're a dual citizen, you think there's a chance that you might move abroad or your children might go to school abroad, especially considering how the difference in price of school in America versus abroad. But that certainly should play a big role in it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we touched on the UTMA accounts. We touched on the 529 plans. We're seeing a lot of folks utilize whole life insurance as an alternative to sort of couple with a 529 plan. Why don't you share a little bit about sort of how that works?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, the primary purpose of life insurance is obviously the life insurance as a death benefit. But what comes along with whole life insurance is cash value. And so that is money that you can use while you're living for whatever purpose you want. And so you can access those cash values a couple of different ways. You can withdraw a portion of the cash value. You could also take a loan against the cash value. If you withdraw up to your basis, a return of principal would be tax-free, and any loans would also be tax-free. And so what many of our clients are doing is to say, all right, maybe there's a 529 for a piece of college, or maybe not, depending on their situation. In addition to that, we're overfunding the cash value of their whole life insurance. So the way that works is you've got your regular base premium deposits or premium contributions. You say, they're contributing X amount per year to their cash value of whole life insurance. In addition to that, they say we want to overfund it. That's what's called paid up additions. You're contributing to the paid up addition portion of your cash value. And that's a great way to save for college, because not only will that money grow, it's not correlated to the market, so we know it's going to grow as long as it's in there for a long enough period of time. And you can use it for college, but you don't have to. And if it turns out that your kid goes abroad or gets a scholarship or goes to trade school, then that's money that you can go do whatever you want with, and there's no penalty for not using it for college. And so a lot of our clients like the certainty of the growth of the cash value, as well as the flexibility to say, great, we could use it for college. It's going to be there for us. We're very confident in that. And if we don't need all of it, that's just going to help us with our retirement planning or anything else that we're choosing to do at that point.
Yep. One of the only things that I think when we do sort of a side-by-side analysis is, oftentimes depending on the rate of return that you assess in the 529 plan, you might lose out a little bit on the net growth between a 529 plan and the cash that grows inside the policy, depending on the return experience on the 529 plan, right? And I think that's really where you've got to get comfortable with, what level of return you actually think you're going to get, and what level of return you think you're comfortable with, within any other strategy, whether it's whole life or anything else. Are you, I think part of the reason why I like the life insurance piece the most is just the flexibility and the utility, right? In all the examples that we've talked about around strategy, the only one that allows you to really be strategic is, or most strategic, is sort of the life insurance piece, right? And it's funny because you mentioned it earlier, even if the best source of capital to fund education with the cheapest opportunity cost is cash flow, and you have the ability to fund it through cash flow at that time, if you have the presence of a 529 plan, you're going to use the 529 plan money, no matter what. It doesn't matter. I don't care what level of cash flow you have, how poor the investment is. It could be down in the markets. You're using the 529 plan to pay for that education, right? And so I don't want it to sound like I'm beating up on the 529 plan, because I do think it has merit and it has value as a part of the strategy. But again, for the listening audience, we invite you to think about college funding and saving for children as a strategy, not as an account.
Yeah. So, the way I think about it is, and I think if I had one kid, I might think differently than the fact that I have 3 kids, right? So 3 kids, maybe $1.5 million of tuition coming my way, and down the road, hopefully a little less. That's a number, right? And so the fact that I know I've got at least the amount of money that I have in the 529s, and I've got the money that I know will be there for me with the cash value of the life insurance. That alone helps me sleep at night, knowing that my goal after the 529 is used is actually first to use my cash flow, my income. I fully expect that to be the case, in which case I could use the cash value of the life insurance for other things, which I've already been doing. I leverage my cash value, not all of it. I leverage a portion of my cash value to go invest in other things. And I do that just because I'm comfortable with it. Not everybody may be comfortable with it. But that helps me sleep better at night, knowing that I've got those cushions on both ends. Hopefully I'm going to use the 529 and then my income. But, I don't know, maybe my income is down. Maybe my tuition is higher than I expected, or whatever the case may be. We got other stuff going on at that point, other expenses. So I think a little bit of both, like a balanced approach, helps me sleep at night, especially knowing I've got 3 tuitions coming my way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, I'm grateful I only have 2. But I think the takeaway that I want folks to leave with, again, is that optionality is critically important. Yeah. Understanding the exits and the exit points for each of the vehicles that you're saving into, I think, is critically important. Having a philosophy around just letting your assets grow and finding the cheapest cost of money at that particular time to fund education, and looking at all your options, is going to be critically important. And so that is to say, when we're strategizing for education, there's not one particular widget, for sure.
Yeah. Nobody ever talks about utilizing a cash out refi or a home equity line of credit. But, if interest rates are where they were, 4 or 5 years ago, that would seem pretty darn attractive. Now, you can't rely on that. You don't know what interest rates are going to be then. But it's nice to be able to have that option and utilize it in that situation.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully this podcast was helpful for folks, again, to sort of reframe the way that education funding is considered. And now I feel a little bit better about being able to have the conversation and make sure that our contemporaries are sort of feeling and planning the same way that we are, is valuable for me.
Yeah, what's been great for me, and I would imagine you probably agree about going through this process, is we're young dads. We haven't paid for college yet. We have clients that range from our age to retirement, but we don't have the actual real world experience of actually paying for college. And so that's why we were going to our mentors and colleagues who have done it both for themselves and many clients, to kind of compare here's our theories, is actually hold true. And sure enough, it is obviously helpful to get to any end goal with as many options available to you. And so I think if you could just think about your decisions from that standpoint, you'll inevitably be in a better position.
Absolutely. Well, to you, the listening audience, we really, really appreciate you tuning in. Please click subscribe below to be notified when we roll out another podcast episode. And let us know if there's anything in particular you want us to be tackling. We'll keep bringing up subjects that we think are of value in the conversations that we're having with our clients. So, Ev, I appreciate you as always and love having the conversation.
Yeah, it was great.
All right,
Talk
man.
to you next time.
Be well.